we can read about the Corinthian ecclesia that met together in a similar way in which we meet almost 2,000 years ago, and we feel a fellowship with them as we consider the words that were written to them by the apostle, words that we can take to ourselves for exhortation this morning. Our theme and our study this weekend has been around chapters 8, 9 and 10, and it began with a simple question posed by the Corinthians to the Apostle Paul in a letter. Should we, or should we not, eat the meat that is for sale in the markets in Corinth that has been previously offered in sacrifice to an idol? Now, we might think that such a question might be answered with a one-word answer, yes or no. But the apostle has demonstrated how we should address such questions. Questions that might cause some disagreement, some dissent, some dispute in our midst. And he has shown us a way of thinking, a way of spiritual thinking, as we address such questions. And he has taken the Corinthians and has role modelled a habit of mind, a habit of spiritual thinking when we address issues where we disagree. And the Apostle Paul has taken into account the context of the Corinthians' lifestyle. And that is a picture there of ancient Corinth as it can be seen today by visitors who travel to Corinth today. And as has been mentioned, that Acrocorinthus, that massive mountain that overshadows the city in both a physical and a moral sense. Because on top of that mountain there was a large temple called the Acrocorinthus, and in that temple the idol Astarte, or Aphrodite as it was known, was worshipped. And associated with the worship of that idol was all kinds of sexual immorality. Built around the worship of that idol was eating and drinking and enjoying life, the finer things of life. And so Corinth was known for enjoyment, for indulgence, for pleasure. And the vices that were on offer in Corinth were enjoyed by the large itinerant population of traders and sailors that visited on a regular basis. It was a place where Romans, public servants and soldiers and other professions retired because there was such enjoyment, from a worldly standpoint at least, to be enjoyed in that place. And so it was a context and a city in which immorality was rife, and it was a challenge to our brothers and sisters. And those who escaped from paganism and enthusiastically left those things behind felt that eating the meat offered to idols that was for sale in the markets was to be unfaithful to their Lord. And they could not eat that meat without remembering all the associations of their former way of life. And so they felt defiled. Their conscience was defiled when they ate the meat. And so they held the view that the meat should not be eaten. At the other end of the ecclesial spectrum in Corinth were the libertines. And the libertines strongly argued that the meat was just meat. Even if it had been offered to an idol, it was irrelevant because the idol is nothing. And there is only one God, and that's the God we worship, and one Lord Jesus Christ. And the oneness of God is such an important doctrine that outweighed the possibility of the meat being offered to the idol being of any importance whatsoever. And so they strongly argued their right to eat the meat. And so we had an impasse in the ecclesia. And so this question was posed to the Apostle Paul. And as we've seen in chapter 8, the Apostle Paul begins to consider the matter by emphasising that any ecclesial dispute should be considered in the context not just of what we know the facts of the matter to be, but we should always, in any ecclesial discussion, interpose love into the question. And we should never make any decision in our lives which does not consider love for our brothers and our sisters, putting them first, considering their needs above our own in any discussion and any decision we make going forward. And so the apostle in chapter 8 emphasised to the Corinthian libertine that wanted to exercise their right to eat that meat no matter what, their need to consider the spiritual well-being of their brother or their sister before making a decision to eat such meat. And the Apostle Paul brought forward the example of the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave his own life for that brother or that sister that you would be treating with disdain if you ignored their spiritual sensitivities. this brother or this sister that you are treading underfoot by treating lightly their views and their sensitivities, that brother or that sister was one for whom Christ died. And it was a very sobering reflection that the Apostle Paul brought up for the libertine to consider. So in any decision we make on this question, says Paul, needs to take account, first and foremost, of the spiritual well-being of our brother and our sister, for whom Christ died. Then in chapter 9, in fact, at the end of chapter 8, Paul says, if it's going to make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world stands, lest I cause my brother or sister to stumble in their faith. And then in chapter 9 we considered yesterday, the Apostle Paul reminded the Corinthians that he had lived out precisely this preparedness to sacrifice our rights or our liberties for our brothers and sisters when he was in their midst. You see, the apostle reminded them that he could have, like many other apostles did, asked for material support, travel expenses, accommodation, food, and so on from the ecclesia when he was in their midst. That would have been quite a reasonable thing to ask for and expect. In fact, the Old Testament taught that principle. The Lord himself, when he sent the disciples out, said, feel free to eat of the hospitality offered to you in whatever homes or whatever towns you visit when you're ministering to their spiritual needs. And the apostles said, this is a spiritual principle. I could have put my hand out and expected to be looked after, but I chose not to do that. I sacrificed my right to ask for such support in order that I might demonstrate that it is more blessed to give than to receive. And so his example of self-sacrifice for the welfare of his brothers and sisters was put forward as one that the Corinthians should follow in this issue of eating meats offered to idols. And so all of chapter 8 and chapter 3/4 of chapter 9 is really emphasising to the Corinthian libertine brother that in making a decision about whether they should eat meat or not that had been offered to idols should be made in the context of considering the welfare of everyone else in your ecclesia and not just your own rights. But then at the end of chapter 9, there's a little bridge passage that pivots the whole consideration. And at the end of chapter 9, we saw the images of athletes and boxers in the Olympic Games brought forward as an example of commitment, of self-denial, of self-sacrifice and single-minded dedication to winning the prize. And we saw the self-sacrifice that athletes made in trying to attain the prize. And he says this is the approach we should take to the grand business of our lives and the prize to which we are striving to achieve. And is visiting the idol temple for social or pleasure reasons really a good idea in the context of what is the grand business of our lives? And he introduced that as a bit of a pivot to move the argument from whether or not we should eat meat for our brother's sake to whether or not we should eat the meat sacrificed to idols for our own spiritual well-being. And so when we turn to chapter 10, the argument is turned back to the libertine brother who has strongly argued his right to eat meat. And we noticed that in this discussion, the Apostle Paul revealed that it wasn't just about eating meat offered to idols at all. But in chapter 8 he said, what if the brother with the weak or sensitive conscience sees you sitting at meat in the idol temple eating such meat? Will it not embolden his conscience to do the same and may lead to his spiritual ruin? Your bad example, if I can put it that way, your example of going to the idol temple to eat the meat may lead to another spiritual ruin. You see, what the apostle reveals is that it's not just a question of whether we should bring that meat home and put it on our own tables or not, but really this was the Corinthian libertine rationalising, involving themselves in a worldly and ungodly lifestyle, thinking that they could handle it, that they could handle any temptation that it might lead to, that the sexual immorality and all the other vices that were on offer as part of the lifestyle package which was associated with the idol and which was so seductive that they could entrench themselves in that lifestyle and that they could handle it. And the Apostle Paul in chapter 10 is going to turn the question back to the libertine and say, really? Do you really think that's what life in Christ is about? Of indulging in the worldly and ungodly lifestyle of Corinth just to the extent that you think you can handle and running the risk of putting yourself in a situation that you can't handle? In other words, flying as close to the wind as you possibly can, allowing as much of the world into your life as you possibly can while you think it's still safe to do so? Is that the approach we should be taking to life in Christ? And this is the question that he's now turning to. And he says in chapter 10, "Moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea." What he does here is going to bring the wilderness generation forward as an example. Now, here's a breakdown of the section that we're going to look at. Verses 1 to 24, which is our whole focus really of our exhortation this morning, is a warning to the libertines about the dangers of idolatry. He's really bringing it home now to the individuals that are making the argument that it's their right, really, and they're free to make any choice they like about whether they eat meat or not. Paul's saying, really, is that a good decision for you and your spiritual well-being and the spiritual well-being of your family, your children, and so on? And so he's going to bring forward the example of Israel, the lessons to be learnt from that example, and the folly of exposing oneself to needless temptation, and then the lesson of the bread and wine, and the same lesson from the sacrifices. And we'll probably just get to around about verse 14 this morning is our intention. So there's 5 blessings that are shared by the entire wilderness generation and by all the Corinthians. Let's read this through. "I would not have you ignorant." That's actually a little phrase that the apostle uses a few times throughout his epistles. He uses this phrase, "I would not have you to be ignorant," when he's signifying something important is about to be discussed. You might remember it's used in 1 Thessalonians, "I would not have you ignorant," and he's talking there about the resurrection. It's used in Romans 1, Romans 11, 1 Corinthians 1, and so on. This is something important. Don't be ignorant of this. This is an important lesson to know. And he's going to say that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. They were all baptised unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They did all eat the same spiritual meat, and they did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So here we have 5 spiritual blessings shared by all the wilderness generation. And he's really saying these are spiritual blessings that we share, that the Corinthians shared. So all our fathers were under the cloud. Now, that, of course, is that cloud that followed them all through the wilderness wanderings. And it was a signifier of God's providential care, and that they were God's people, and that God's love was upon them. They all passed through the sea. And in fact, in doing so, with the cloud over their heads, they were encased in water, and they were all baptised into Moses, which is rather a quaint expression, really. And what he's saying is that they were initiated, just as we are by baptism into Christ, they were initiated into the principles which Moses stood for. Moses was their leader. Moses was blessed by God to be their leader. And the things that Moses stood for, they embraced and were baptised into, associated or identified with as they passed through that Red Sea and the miracle that was done for Moses and his people. They were associated and identified with Moses and shared in the blessings that flowed from that identification as a consequence. And so they were surrounded by water. And this is a parable of our baptism. And so we are just like them. What Paul is trying to draw out here is that the Corinthians and these Israelites leaving Egypt behind, travelling through the wilderness, they're identical, really. That's just another generation of God's people going through the same experiences. So he's trying to draw together a strong association between the Corinthian brothers and sisters and the wilderness generation. And we could do the same for ourselves. And he goes on and he says, all were baptised, and all, this is relevant now. All did eat the same spiritual meat. You see, this is about meat being offered to idols and whether we should eat or not. They all ate this same spiritual meat and drank the same spiritual drink. In other words, this meal that they shared. I mean, what meal is he talking about? Well, first of all, the spiritual meat was the manna. It is called in Psalm 78:25, angels' food. It was provided from heaven. It was called bread from heaven and water from the rock to drink. Nehemiah 9 verses 15 and 20. It's called bread from heaven and water from the rock to drink. In Exodus 16, it is called the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. It's spiritual food because it comes from God, and that's why it is this amazing spiritual food and spiritual drink. And all Israel were nourished and supported in a miraculous way by this. And of course, the drink itself was the water that came from the rock, and it was provided at the beginning of the journey. In Exodus 17, it's recorded that water came from the rock. And then on the second occasion, when it's recorded in Numbers 20, it's in the 40th year of their wilderness wandering. So in the first year and the 40th year, water flowed from the rock. The second time, you might remember, Moses struck the rock and he was condemned for it. And as Hebrews points out, in Hebrews 6, it was a symbol of crucifying Christ afresh. And so that's why it was so significant and why Moses was not allowed to enter into the land, because it was a type of Christ. And that's what the apostle says here. That rock was Messiah. That rock represented the provision of spiritual drink that God would provide, refreshment, water from the living well that God would provide through the provision of Messiah. Now, why is Paul retelling Israel's history in this way? These 5 amazing things that happened to Israel. Well, he obviously wants the Corinthians to see the obvious parallel. They, the Corinthians, had the very same blessings, just as we do. We are partaking this morning of spiritual food, spiritual meat, and spiritual drink. The thing about the Israelite generation, though, was that they failed dismally. Just have a look at verse 5. So all of them shared all these 5 blessings, but with many, and the Greek is most, with most of them, by far the majority of them, there was only a handful that finally got into the land of those that wandered through the wilderness. With most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. So this word many means most. Now, what was the circumstances then of their failure? And can we learn some lessons, Paul says to the Corinthians, about their failure? Even though they started off really well, escaping from Egypt in miraculous circumstances, being sustained by God, all the amazing blessings that we all share together, can we look at that generation and learn from their failure and draw some lessons that might help us in our lives, and in particular can help us answer this question that you've asked of me about meats being offered to idols and whether we should eat them or not? The word overthrown means it's katastronumi, or catastrophe. It was a catastrophe. It means they were strewn. As Moses led the people through the wilderness, there were just bodies strewn behind. And it was like this trail of dead bodies for 40 years as the whole generation just died one after another. Why did they fail so dismally? What happened? Well, verse 6 and verse 11 repeats the same thing. Now, these things were our examples. And verse 11. Now, all these things happened to them for examples. Twice he says it. In verse 6 he says, now these things were our examples to the intent that we should not do what they did. In verse 11 he says, now these things happened to them for examples, and they are written for our admonition and our learning, upon whom the ends of the ages are come. Don't miss the lesson, he's saying. They are recorded for us as an example. Now, what's recorded for us? Well, the interposing verses between 6 and 11, halfway through verse 6 to verse 10, there are 5 big mistakes. So he started the chapter off with 5 major blessings that we share with them. Now let's consider the 5 big mistakes they made and ask ourselves the question whether we share those mistakes. Because we need to learn to avoid these mistakes, because it was the source of their downfall. He mentions 5 things. Let's just read them through. 1, to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. 2, neither be idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. 3, neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed and fell in one day 320,000. 4, neither let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of serpents. 5, and finally, neither murmur ye as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. There are their 5 big mistakes. Now, has Paul just selected a bunch of random things? I mean, you could probably think of more mistakes they made. Why those 5? Well, Paul does have a reason for selecting those 5, apart from them being very big mistakes that they made, and perhaps the 5 big ones. But they teach something to the Corinthians about their current issue that they're asking questions about. Let's consider these things and what they actually are. Come back to Numbers chapter 11, the first one, which is lusting after evil things. What does this mean, lusting after evil things? What does this mean? Well, this is the event recorded in Numbers 11. Lusting after evil things. They're called evil things because they're things that cause injury, devastation, spiritual ruin. What were the things they lusted after that caused spiritual ruin? Well, they lusted after the things that were they left behind in Egypt. And have a look at this, Numbers 11. And verse 4. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting, you see, lusting after evil things. And the children of Israel wept. And what were they lusting after? And they said, who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. And the manna was as coriander seed, and the colour thereof was the colour of bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it and ground it and so on. And verse 10, and Moses heard the people weep throughout the door, their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of Yahweh was kindled greatly, and Moses was greatly displeased. They were complaining about the spiritual food, that it was boring, that it was monotonous, that it was always the same, every morning the same. You know, we just get up in the morning, there's this manna, everyday manna, complain, whinge. And they began to lust after a wider variety of food options that had been on offer in Egypt. Who shall give us flesh to eat? And in particular, they wanted flesh. And then Moses despairs in verse 14 and says, God, I am not able to bear all this people alone. It's too heavy for me. If they deal thus with me, kill me. Moses says, just kill me. I'm sick of dealing with these people. And God said, well, look, gather the 70 men in verse 16. I want to bring them forward. I've got something to say. Bring them forward. And verse 18, say thou unto the people, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow. There's something big happening tomorrow. You're going to get what you ask for. You're going to eat flesh. You have wept in the ears of Yahweh, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Really? How short are our memories? Therefore the Lord will give you the flesh, and you will eat it. You will not eat it one day. You will not eat it 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, solid, you're going to eat nothing but flesh until it comes out your nostrils, until it be loathsome unto you. because that ye have despised Yahweh which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why have we come out of Egypt? And so it happened. In verse 31, there went forth a wind from Yahweh and brought quails from the sea, and he let them fall by the camp as it were a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on that side. So you could walk for a day that way, any direction, and there was nothing but quails. And they were 2 cubits high. You were wading through quails. You want flesh? You have it up to your waist. And the people stood up all that day and all that night and all the next day, and they gathered the quails in a frenzy, in an absolute frenzy. And he that gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp. And while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of Yahweh was kindled against the people, and Yahweh smote the people with a very great plague. So, this is what it means by lusting after evil things. You know, we've got very short memories, haven't we? The associations of the worldly lifestyle have been, and the fact that they were slaves, and that there was nothing good going for them in Egypt, and they escaped Egypt enthusiastically. They couldn't wait to get out of there, and it was only months down the track that they were longing to be back there. And they were getting bored with the dry stuff that God was offering them. Even though the miracles were happening every day, they were blind to it. Every day, the miracle of the manna. How fickle are we as human beings? And in Corinth, they'd escaped from paganism and the immorality and all the devastating consequences that immorality brings in our lives. And they'd escaped all that. And now we've got brothers and sisters sneaking back into the idol temples because of the indulgences that are on offer there. Only a couple of years after being converted out of that, being saved from that, to the wonder of the gospel, to the salvation that we've been so graciously given, and they're sneaking back to have a taste of what the world has to offer, thinking that they can have a foot in both camps. And they might have been doing it, rationalising away, thinking, well, I can handle it. I know that an idol is nothing in the world. I know that there's only one God. I can go into that idol temple and I know that there's nothing substantial there. But they still go back there with what they've got on offer. The second thing, they turn back to idols. Exodus chapter 32, come back here. This is the quote that Paul's referring to here. Exodus 32. 32. This is well known. Moses, you see, delayed coming down out of the mountain, and the people gathered themselves up unto Aaron. He'd been away for 40 days. Their faith was wavering. They weren't sure where Moses was and whether he was coming back. They said, up, make us gods, which shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. We don't know where he's gone. He's been gone now for 40 days. And Aaron said, break off your golden earrings, which are in the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me. And the people broke off their earrings, and they brought them to Aaron, and he received them at their hand and fashioned them with a graving tool, and after he made it, a molten calf. And they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it and made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh. So we've got the people making a golden calf. We've got Aaron looking at it with a bit of consternation, thinking, where's this going? I'd better transform this as much as possible into something good. So he tries to rationalise bringing the worship of God into the whole equation. But as far as the people of Israel are concerned, they rose up early, enthusiastically, like the morning of the quails. They rose up enthusiastically. They offered burnt offerings. They brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink the food in front of the idol, and then they rose up to play. Sexual immorality is what that little phrase, to play, means. And, well, we know what happened when Moses came down from the mountain. And he said, who's on Yahweh's side? Go through and kill them. And so it happened. And how weak Aaron looked when Moses came down. When Moses said, what were you thinking, Aaron? And Aaron said, oh, look, they brought all this stuff, and I put it in the molten vessel, and out popped a calf. And it was a dreadful sin. They made the mistake. That's verse 24, by the way. Just look at that. Aaron's explaining to Moses what happened. And I said unto them, whosoever hath any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it me, and then I cast it into the fire, and there out came this calf. How did that happen? And this rationalisation, this justification of involving ourselves in what we've left behind. And they committed fornication. This third phrase that Paul makes, that they committed fornication, refers specifically to Numbers 25. Let's have a look at that. Now, if I had the time, I'd take you from 1 Corinthians 8 and the references made there, 1 Corinthians 10, and show how that each of these incidents were these specific incidents being referred to. I'm not just saying these are the ones referred to. It's clear from the references he makes that these are the specific ones he's referring to. So Numbers 25 verses 1 to 9 is the specific case because of the plague and so on that's made reference to. So Israel at this point were abiding in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom, spiritual immorality, with the daughters of Moab. Baal Peor. But look what they were doing. They called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bowed down to their gods. You see, this was a meal of fellowship that they were being called to. And they fellowshiped with the people, they bowed down to their gods, and then they involved themselves in sexual immorality. And that's what it means in verse 3 when it says, and Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor. This is a joining together in sexual immorality. And the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and Yahweh said unto Moses, take all the heads of the people and hang them up before Yahweh against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And then right down the bottom, Phinehas is involved. He stops the plague in its tracks in verse 9, and those that died in the plague were 20 and 4,000. So we have people eating and drinking, sacrifices made to idols, and getting involved in sexual immorality. They rationalised, oh, well, we're just having a meal together, that's fine. We're just going to the restaurant, we're just eating their meat that's been offered unto idols. And then they were being sucked right in to the lifestyle. You see, idolatry was not just a little idol that you had in your home. That's not what idolatry was. You see, the ancient people were much like ourselves. They weren't completely stupid. They didn't see a little idol in their home and think, oh, well, that's a real God. That can do miracles and so on. That idol was merely a reminder of the whole package that idolatry meant for them. It was like having some sort of badge on your wall saying, I belong to this team, or, you know, I'm part of this club. It was saying, if you had that idol in your home, that you were part of the team. You were part of the society in which you lived. You were part of it. And you embraced it. Everything that they believed, all the philosophies around it. And so the lifestyle package on offer in Corinth was not just worshipping the idol, but it was the whole social environment, the festivals and the celebrations and the fellowship meals and the wonderful wine and food and the great things that happened around that. And they made their own rules. That's what's great about idolatry. You just make your own rules. Whatever we think, we just make the rules, however it suits us. And so they made rules that appealed to the flesh. They said in Corinth, literally, that when we pray on our festivals to the goddess Aphrodite, that the more prostitutes are there and the more we're involved with them, the more likely that God will bless us. Isn't that a convenient religion? They had food and drink, satisfying human desires. It was very ritualistic. People love ritual. You know, it's very ritualistic. Get the family together and have a ritual. And they defined what was good and virtuous. And it reflected society's beliefs and what they wanted. And it's a very seductive thing. Very seductive. And you get involved in it at your peril because it just drags you and sucks you in. When it says that Jezebel seduced my servants to commit whoredoms and worship idols, it means that. She seduced them. It appeals to the flesh. It's not something that our flesh reviles from. It's something that appeals to our baser nature. The other thing about it is that it hates non-conformity. You know, in Babylon, when they put that idol up, everyone had to bow down, and the people that were left standing, they hate them because it's like this condemnation. They sort of realise that they can't force people to do it, but they do anyway because they really encourage conformity. And the world does that. It tries to press us into its mould. And we get involved at our peril. The next thing is that they tempted the Lord. They tempted the Lord. It says tempted Christ in 1 Corinthians 8, but other translations say they tempted the Lord. It was Yahweh, obviously, that they were tempting in the wilderness in Numbers chapter 21. What does this mean, to tempt the Lord? As we turn this passage up, let me pose that question to you. What does it mean to tempt God? Can we tempt God? What it means is this. You test the boundaries of God's forbearance. That's what it means. You test how far you can go before God reacts in some way. And so the Israelites involved themselves in as much of Egypt's stuff and as much of the idolatry of the nations around them that they think they could get away with before God reacted in anger. That's what it is to test God. To say, you know, you see some people say, well, if there is a God, strike me now with lightning. You know, they're tempting God, trying to get God to act, provoke him to action. And in a way, when we engage in worldliness or ungodliness in our lives, in a sense we're saying, well, how much can I get involved before it starts to make God angry? I mean, how much can I get away with and still get into the kingdom, in essence? You're tempting God. It's entirely the wrong thinking process, entirely wrong. But this is what they were doing in the wilderness. In Numbers 21, verses 4 to 9. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged. And the people spake against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loathes this manna. They're going on about how much they hate the manna. And they're just complaining and complaining and whinging until God reacts. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. And therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto Yahweh that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And Yahweh said unto Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looked upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass and put it on a pole, and it came to pass that if a serpent bit any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. There's a couple of points to note here. First of all, they're complaining again about the manna, and that they're wanting to eat the food of Egypt, but also that they're tempting God. And in this particular one here, if you really want to establish that that's what it means, you need to refer back to 1 Corinthians 8 and see the reference. But the last one here is they murmured. They murmured. Just come back to Exodus 16 to see an example of murmuring. This is the one thing that was a recurrent theme in the wilderness, complaining and whinging. People complaining about their predicament. And really, that was what was going on in the Corinthian ecclesia. They were whinging, they wanted to do what they want, they didn't want to have to be beholden in any way to the others in the ecclesia, or to have the sensitive brothers in the ecclesia having an impact upon what I could do, and they're complaining about that to the Apostle Paul. This was going on in the wilderness in Exodus 16, verses 2 and 3. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, would to God we had died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us out into the wilderness to kill us with hunger. And we remember the meat that we ate in Egypt. So, when you look at all these things, lusting after evil things, idolatry, sexual immorality, tempting God, murmuring, why these big five are mentioned? Because they were lusting after meat in the first one. They ate and drank and rose up to play in the second one. They ate meat offered to idols and then participated in sexual immorality in the third one. Our soul loathes this light bread. We want meat in the fourth one. We long for the flesh pots of Egypt in the fifth one. And here the Corinthians are asking the question, can we eat the meat offered to idols? And when we come back to 1 Corinthians 10, to draw home the lesson here, what we see is that these things happen to them that we might learn a lesson. And so he says here in verse 11, now all these things happen to them for examples and are written for our admonition upon whom the end of the world is come. Wherefore, he says in verse 12, wherefore, this is the lesson. Let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Never be too confident. Never think you are too strong to fail. Never think you can put temptation in your way and withstand it. You see, this word think means you have an opinion about yourself that is probably wrong, or maybe right or wrong. It's just an opinion, but actually it's wrong. Let him that thinks he stand take heed. And so this is a warning to the Corinthian libertine who claims to be strong, who claims that he can cope with the temptations he's putting himself in when he goes into the idol temple. Be very careful, he's saying. You're flirting with a very dangerous thing. You're flirting with idolatry. And what God wants us to understand is that idolatry, worldliness, ungodliness, all the stuff that the world has to offer us, which is so inconsistent with the principles that God would have us live by, is not something we should flirt with. It's dangerous to our spiritual well-being. And so Paul is encouraging the Corinthian libertine that failure is not out of the question for them. And even if you don't fail, even if you can cope with it, one of the questions Paul tries to encourage them to ask is this: can your children cope with it? Can your wife cope with it? Or your husband? Can your grandchildren cope with it? Can the brothers and sisters in your ecclesia cope with it? Maybe you can cope with it. But what sort of an example are you setting your brothers and sisters? And might what you're doing, if it doesn't lead to your spiritual ruin, which it well may, will it lead to the spiritual ruin of others within your circle of influence? And so we've got to see temptation as not something to be flirted with. Verse 13, there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Now, Paul's not saying we will inevitably fail, but Paul is saying we need to be aware of the possibility of our own failure. He put that before them, his own possibility of failure at the end of chapter 9 when he said, I need to fight seriously the battle with my own body, lest I myself, when I preach to others, may be a castaway. What he was doing is putting before them his own example, thinking, I am very aware of my own possibility of failure. But are you, in your confident assertion that you can engage in flirting with the lifestyle the Corinthians have, the Corinth has to offer, and survive it? Do you know, temptations are common, and God will support us in temptation. And there's no temptation really that hasn't already been experienced, and there are three main lusts, and we know what they are. But God will always make a way to escape. But you know, the way to escape idolatry, the way to escape spiritual immorality, the way to escape ungodliness, is not to throw yourself into the centre of it and see how you fare. That's not how to deal with that. There is a way of escape, and God has provided it. And there it is in verse 14. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, you can see his appeal here to the Corinthian libertine. My dearly beloved, I love you, I want the best for you, but please take what I'm saying now seriously in your approach to the Corinthian lifestyle package that's on offer surrounding the issue of idolatry. Flee. Flee. That is the way to escape. So, brothers and sisters, flirting with ungodliness, flirting with sin, flying as close to the boundary of what's acceptable or what we perceive to be acceptable as possible, to do as much of the worldly lifestyle as we think we can get away with and still get into the kingdom. Should this be our attitude? In contrast, look at the attitude of our Lord, who lived every day fully immersed in his Father's thinking, who fled any suggestion of sin and worked hard every day to live only a godly life. As we approach our Lord's return, brothers and sisters, let us see that the stakes are high. Let us not be careful about being too confident. The danger of overconfidence. A firm confidence in our own spiritual status is no evidence that we are safe. That's Paul's warning. Such confidence may be one of the strongest evidences that we are in fact in danger. Those who are most safe understand their own weaknesses and feebleness and frailties, and who feel their need of divine aid and strength. They will then rely on the true source of strength, and they will be secure. At times of greatest spiritual confidence and elation, we are often least likely to be humbly dependent on God, and least likely to be on guard against temptation, and are susceptible to fall into difficulty. Example, King David, 2 Samuel 11 verse 1. And the cycle of spiritual decline and revival throughout the history of God's people shows that spiritual confidence inevitably leads to spiritual decline. Even the Apostle Paul was ever vigilant, lest he should become a castaway despite all he had done for the gospel. And consider those on the left hand in Matthew 7. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, have we not done many things in your name? We've prophesied in your name, cast out devils, in your name done many wonderful works. And I'll profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. So let's decide not to look back longingly into the world from which we've escaped, lusting after the flesh pots of Egypt. To not introduce the world's lifestyle package into our lives, idolatry and covetousness. To not introduce sexual immorality or allow it at any level into our lives. So dangerous and devastating can it be. Not to push the boundaries of what is acceptable to God, to tempt God, to see if we can get away with it. That's not the approach at all. And these are the 5 things that we should avoid. Not be a whinger. Not a complainer, not a murmurer, but a builder. Not a source of stumbling, but a source of encouragement. To be constructive, faithful, a positive influence on those around us. So let's be careful not to minimise the danger of any of these things in our lives. That's the mistake the Corinthians made. I can handle it, it's okay. So they go up to the idol temple on Saturday night and then arrive at the meeting on Sunday morning saying, no problem. Potentially, that will ultimately lead to spiritual ruin of yourself, your family, and potentially your ecclesia. Rather be proactive about spiritual mindedness. Put in place strategies to build a positive spiritual atmosphere in your home, in your personal life, and in your ecclesia. The fight can be won against temptation. The fight must be won. We must take the lead, contribute constructively in every aspect of our lives, not look at what we can get away with, but look at what we can positively build in our lives to build constructively a spiritual mind and spiritual conduct. To communicate that positively amongst each other. Not to whinge, not to murmur, but to be thankful constantly for what God has given us. His miraculous blessings are renewed every day. And decide to demonstrate to others by your way of life that godliness has more to offer than worldliness. And make a positive difference in someone's life today. And after this memorial meeting, in your conversations and the way you talk, make someone's day spiritually. Build someone up. Send someone away with the feeling that it was good to have been here this morning. And let us remind ourselves constantly of the blessings we have in Christ Jesus.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthAndProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos that we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.